is going to speak on that. Mr. McKinnon.
Firstly, Chair, thank you, Chair. I'd like to note that there appears to be a miscommunication in the drafting. I'd like to move that as 3 years instead of 5 years, with respect both to the French and the English versions of that.
Where are we and what paragraph?
It's
oh yeah, 5 years, and 5 years after the section comes into force, you want that to be 3 years.
I'd like to move that as 3 years.
So does that need to be a sub-amendment, or does that, we'll just accept it? Okay, 3 years.
Okay. So it has been said that this bill, this initiative, is an experiment. I disagree. It puts an end to an experiment that was began 90 years ago. An experiment that was initiated without debate or study or any evidence to justify it, simply by adding cannabis to a list of prohibited substances. But that 90 years is too great a distance to travel in one giant step. There's 90 years of history to overcome, 90 years of societal attitudes, myths, and misunderstandings to change. It's too much to achieve in one great leap. So in order to succeed, in the end, we need to follow a middle course. That's what this bill attempts to do, in my view. But it's also it's a transformational bill, but I believe it's also a transitional bill. I don't expect that this will be the final step along this path. I think that it will be appropriate to revisit this as we go forward. And that's what this amendment intends to do, is to mandate a review in 3 years' time so that we can make any course adjustments that as may seem warranted from the new perspective and experience we have gained at that time. This amendment is consistent with it's modeled after a similar provision in the Federal Public Sector Labor Relations Act and the Public Service Employments Act. It will give us a chance to adjust our course as we go forward. And thank you.
Okay. No further comment. Mr. Davies.
Thank you. Well, I this amendment insofar as it recognizes, I think, what we all can fairly acknowledge as certain gaps, at the very best gaps, at the worst deficiencies in this bill, and so to the extent that this amendment would require a review of this bill within 3 years, I think that's good. Where I might part ways with Mr. McKinnon's statement is that yes, the legal regime has been enforced for over 100 years in this country, but criticism of the criminalized approach and not only suggestions but evidence research and commission inquiries have been recommending really since 1972 that cannabis be decriminalized or legalized. So it's not like we just thought of this in the last 2 years. There has been a mountain of evidence, a mountain of academic work, a mountain of sociological data that has been amassed over the last 40 years that points to this. I'm reminded of the dictum of Mackenzie King, where he said, liberals never do by halves what they can do by quarters. And I think that this bill is a good example of that. On the other hand, liberals often accuse New Democrats of being liberals in a hurry. What I really think is that we need to take an evidence-based approach that is faithful to the principles and avowed purposes of this bill. And that's where I'm a little bit disappointed with this bill. We know that prohibition doesn't work. We know that criminalizing cannabis has really done nothing positive whatsoever, yet this bill maintains a criminalized prohibitionist approach to cannabis. We know that the purposes of the bill are to bring production out of the illegal black market and bring it into the regulated market so that we have regulated supplies of quality controlled cannabis, and we reduce the impact of organized crime, yet we leave a gaping hole of edibles, concentrates, and non-smokable products to the black market. Why? Because Liberals say, well, we're not ready. Well, why are we? What more do we need to know about those products than we know now? You know, we keep pointing to the example of Colorado, who claims that they went too fast by legislating edibles, but what they failed to point out is that Colorado, then with the experience, corrected their legislative regime. And frankly, we have gold standards of regulatory provisions concerning edibles and other products. But instead, this government wants to leave those products to the black market. I've said this repeatedly. Organized crime is not going to sell edibles in child-proof containers. They're not going to stamp their products with THC. Canadians cooking brownies on their stove are not going to have any way of ensuring that their brownies in the pan have a even spread of THC throughout the cannabis. The cannabis brownies are not going to have a stamp on them so that a child or another adult won't unwittingly pick up a brownie, not knowing that it's got THC in it. That's how the Liberals are leaving edibles. And all because they're saying, well, we must move slowly and we have to review this in 3 years. What I fail to understand is why this government isn't moving now on the clear evidence that they know now. They do that partially, and I'll answer the question. Yeah, the question is because Liberals are trying to have it both ways. They're trying to look like they're hip to the issue of cannabis by pursuing so-called legalization, but they want to appeal to the conservative side of their party by making it seem that they're really not really wanting to go there. And so the result of that is that we have a bill that's neither fish nor fowl. We have a bill that is neither full legalization nor is it full prohibition, but somewhere in between. So while I agree that we should be reviewing this bill in 3 years, my position is that's not an excuse for us to fail to make necessary amendments to this bill now. And I'm fairly disappointed that Liberals have voted down just about every amendment that's been proposed by the New Democrats, some of which I respect because it's a question of philosophy or approach, but some of which just plainly ignores the evidence before this committee and that Canadians are aware of. So I will support this, but ask my Liberal colleagues to have the courage to make the changes that they know need to be made to this bill now at committee. My final point is going to be Mr. Trudeau campaigned on the idea of making committees more responsive to loosen the control of the ministry over committees and let committees operate independently. And what I've seen by the rote voting on the Liberal side to amendments that my colleagues on the Liberal side know are amendments that arose in many cases squarely from the evidence we heard, tells me that that promise that Mr. Trudeau made to Canadian parliamentarians about the committee being free to act more independently has not really come to bear, at least in this bill.
Much, Mr. Oliver.
I come back again to this issue of this being rushed. So it's been very clear this was a campaign issue for the Liberals in the last campaign. The task force traveled for 6 months across Canada, had thousands and thousands of witnesses and tens of thousands of submissions to them. They brought very good advice forward, and the legislation has been drafted and before this committee for some period of time now. We heard from over 100 witnesses. We did it in a very efficient way rather than doing that over about 3 to 4 months, which is what it would normally have taken to do that many. We did it in a consolidated sitting. And I think the advantage of that consolidated sitting is that we heard from different perspectives and you could hear more easily where there were differing views. And we did hear, I think, from our witnesses, there were very, very different perspectives on this bill. And it is a big social change for us. So we heard from health people, health providers saying go slow. Cannabis it needs to be treated with great caution. But we heard from the user community, I guess, that this is happening. It's happening right now. We're outgrowing the government. Quotes was their words, I think, and things need to move faster. What we do know for sure is that our youth are using this drug. They're getting it from black markets. They're buying it from unknown vendors of unknown production, and it's just not safe as it sits. So there's a need to move forward with the legislation and get it back to the House. There is, we heard from the provinces and territories and our police forces that they need clarity from the federal legislation as to what's happening, so they can go to their next level of work to make sure that the provinces and territories and the municipalities have this understood. So I don't think this is rushed, but I do feel we need to keep moving it forward. I think some of the suggestions from Mr. Davies would have put it on pause while parts of this was reopened and re-examined. I think coming back to this in 3 years' time will give enough data, enough understanding of the implications and the consequences of this legislation that if fine-tunings or improvements are needed, they can be introduced. Mr. Davies has mentioned edibles a few times. We have a motion coming later in amendments to require that happen within a year, not within this 3-year cycle. So I think we all heard that testimony and feel a need to respond to it, but do it in a safe, thoughtful, regulated way, which is the goal of this. So I do support this motion. I think it's important that there be a review for many of the reasons that Mr. Davies raised, many of the points that he's made. But I just think we need time to see this at work in Canadian society before we make any further big changes to this particular act.
Thank you very much. Mr. Van Kesteren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I was going to let this one slide, but Mr. Davies opened the door, and so and Mr. Oliver as well. First of all, campaign promise. Let's really look at that as the real reality which took place, which was a third-place party, which I don't think too many Canadians thought had a hope of ever achieving government, let alone a major majority, with a promise that was in the back of the books. I'm going to tell you, I'd love to do a poll. How many people that I approached at the door said, you know, Van Kesteren, we want to talk about this marijuana deal? Not one. I don't think anybody, it wasn't on anybody's radar. So to suggest that this was a hot campaign item, I don't think is fair. Secondly, history was brought up twice, and I love history. Mr. McKinnon first mentioned the fact that, you know, we've had, I think he said 70 or 80 years, 90 years of bad history. Then Mr. Davies said, well, you know, since the 70s, but I know I quoted China, and I'm reminded of that Chinese general, forget his name, that when they asked him after the Chinese Revolution what he thought of the French Revolution, he says, it's too early to tell. You know, that's so true, because in the same breath, Mr. McKinney, you're forgetting why in the early part of the 20th century, Canada, which is a young democracy, which has very little experience in these things, had such strong drug laws. And it was because we had, from that period of time, an example of how drugs can destroy a society. We've forgotten. And I argued that earlier today, and I think that just needs to be recognized, that there's good reason. It isn't that, well, a bunch of killjoys and geez, the young people want to smoke up, so why should we stop? And there is collective history that a lot of wise people, Mr. Casey, enacted in law for good reason. So I don't think the history argument is at all a fair argument. If we're going to use it, let's go back in history and let's talk about those things. And again, the campaign promise, I don't buy that. I really don't think Canadians really expected us to have a government in place that would enact this type of legislation.
Okay.
For such, I'll be voting against this amendment as well, too.
Thank you very much. Well, seeing no further speakers, I'd like to call for a vote on Liberal 16. All in favor? All opposed? Liberal 16 is carried. Now we have a series